So firstly, if you're injured yourself, you have to know you are not alone. And you are not a tiny group of people. You are not alone. There are lots of us, and help is available from us, and help and support and friendship. So you're really not alone. That's the most important thing to remember.
Today, I'm joined by Caroline Pover, author of the COVID Adverse Reaction Survival Guide and founding member of this UK CV family. Now, Caroline was diagnosed with a severe adverse reaction to a single dose of the AstraZeneca Covid vaccination in March 2021, and the effect of such injuries put a dramatic stop to her previously productive and fulfilling life, where she went from teacher for girls to publisher for women and humanitarian aid worker before embarking on further entrepreneurial endeavors. Now, unfortunately, despite her best efforts, it took over 2 years to make any semblance of a recovery. The great news, as we'll hear today, is that she has begun to really accelerate her progress. Nonetheless, her drive and resilience during this time has been put to really strong use with her writing this book and also being a founding member of the UK CV family, a vaccine injury support group. And she's frequently interviewed about her experience in giving talks through the lens of the vaccine injured. Now, today, our conversation is more than just a conversation about recovering from vaccine injuries. It's about compassion and kindness in the modern world. Caroline, it's lovely to have you with us. And first and foremost, how are you feeling today?
I'm okay. I don't feel too bad today, thank you. I am due for. I have a very specific and unusual treatment, which we might end up talking about. I have that every 2 weeks, and I'm due for that tomorrow. So I'm not. I might tire a little bit easier than usual today.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about your journey as we go through in terms of your recovery. But firstly, I'd be really interested to describe how you actually found out about the injury itself, the vaccine injury. Did you initially, when you developed symptoms, link what you're experiencing to the vaccine? How did you come to the diagnosis that you have today?
The paramedics told me immediately. So I didn't know anything about vaccine injuries before. I always described myself as vaccine ignorant. It did not occur to me at all that what was happening was related to the vaccine. It did happen. My reaction started on the same day, so exactly 9 hours after having the jab. And the paramedics were called within a few hours, and they immediately said, "Have you had the COVID vaccine?" And they said, there were two phrases that they said, was it the Oxford one? And they said, "We're seeing a lot of this." And I think at the time, I wasn't quite with it at the time, but I remember at the time questioning it actually, because I was that ignorant. So I had no idea at all. And I said to them, I didn't know this could happen. And then when I was taken to the hospital, the A&E staff there also said adverse reaction, and that was my diagnosis right from the beginning.
Wow. And then what about the broader reaction from the medical system as you started to get treatment? Was there the same acknowledgement or acceptance of that prognosis or diagnosis from the outset?
I haven't had any treatment from the NHS or from any modern medicine. So there isn't any treatment. There are no pathways designed for anybody who's had an adverse reaction. So, but I have been treated on the whole very kindly. I have to say that. There have been some very kind NHS staff that I've met. I've also met NHS staff who themselves have had severe reactions, and they've been, on the whole, open and kind and sympathetic to talking to me. And I know this is not the case for the vast majority of people who are vaccine injured.
Yeah, do you consider yourself lucky in that regard? It seems that, there are many people who have had all kinds of reactions and injuries following the COVID vaccination. And, you had this almost instant diagnosis or recognition of the symptoms from those who you called in the paramedics. Why do you think other people aren't so lucky? Why do you think the medical system is so unwilling to embrace this potential reality?
I think some of it may well have been to do with the timing. So because for me, the reaction happened very, very quickly, then I think that was part of it. But I think I do think I've just been very lucky. I think I've communicated. I think after the first initial, there were a lot of very confusing emotions at the beginning, and I was angry and upset and distressed and traumatized and all those kinds of experiences. But once all those kinds of feelings, but once I think I dealt with that and didn't let that come into the way that I communicated with medical staff, then I think once that happened, I did see a continued ongoing improvement in the way that they've treated me. And I think that because I've informed myself as well, I've learned an awful lot. I can actually talk to them about things related to vaccine injury that they don't know about. So my general sense has been, again, I'm very, very lucky. I know this is unusual. It's been that they've been interested in learning more about it, actually. And in fact, this would have been about a year ago, one NHS staff worker said, she actually said that you could be teaching us about this. And this is something that I think a lot of the medical profession need to do in the UK or globally as well, as they need to be learning from the vaccine injured.
Well, it's interesting. It almost seems like a reversal of the doctor-patient relationship in many ways. They're having to learn from you, perhaps because it's a new phenomenon, and that it's seemingly very little professional guidance when it comes to how to diagnose and treat. As you mentioned, there's very little medical pathways for people to follow, if any, at this stage. How do you think other people in a similar situation to you can actually take their situation further with the medical system? Is there things that people can do to learn from your experience in order to get greater recognition of the problem, do you think?
I actually try to encourage people to look outside of modern medicine to get support and treatment. I think there are an awful lot of healing modalities available and healing practitioners available that the modern medicine, they need. It's not even like an alternative. In some ways, they're very traditional treatments that are available. And I think people should be looking. I would encourage people. We all kind of make our own choice about what we're looking for, but I think I would encourage people to be looking outside. And partly that is because if you go within the modern medical system, they're only really set up for 7-minute conversation. There's very little healing that can happen within those 7 minutes. Whereas if you go to something a bit more traditional, usually the appointments are going to be about an hour, and there's an awful lot of healing that can happen, even if it's not treatments or recovery. There's a lot of healing on a emotional and spiritual level that can happen within an hour of talking to somebody who's genuinely committed to trying to help you deal with a very traumatic and difficult experience, both physically, emotionally, and spiritually.
Absolutely. I'd like to talk more about that a little bit later on, because I think it's so important to understand that and the kind of boundaries or the parameters of the current healthcare system and what other options are available to help people with their healing. We've talked about the reaction of the medical system, but how is the reaction? What sort of reactions have you received from other people when you tell people that you've experienced an injury as a result of the COVID vaccine?
In the beginning, people were extremely uncomfortable when I said it to them, and I remember feeling actually quite shocked that people would respond in that way to something. And when you were suffering and you were clearly so ill, I remember being quite surprised about that and shocked, and it was distressing, actually, really upsetting. This is in the early days when I first started telling people were a lot of people were very, very uncomfortable with me talking about it. I did have situations where people I knew would kind of take a step back, like a physical step back from me when I was talking to them. And that confused me. And then I did have situations where people would cross over the road, actually, once I had told them about it. And that was very distressing. But I kept telling people, I kept talking about it. I did notice there was a difference in people's reactions when I used to say I had an adverse reaction to the COVID vaccine. compared to when I would say I had an adverse reaction to the AstraZeneca vaccine. When I used the actual name of the vaccine, people seemed to respond differently. I thought that was quite an interesting response that people had. It may have been that I had AstraZeneca before stories were coming out about possible blood clots, and perhaps once people started to hear about them, they became a bit more comfortable with me talking about it. But over time, as time's gone on, I've kept talking about it. I talk about it to anybody where it's relevant, but I talk about it a lot, and the reaction has completely changed now. Most people, when I mention I've had an adverse reaction, they know somebody or they themselves have been struggling. And this happens now nearly every time I mention it to somebody new. Somebody knows somebody else or is dealing with something similar themselves. And the reaction now is very kind, is very sympathetic. I very rarely meet anybody who is unkind or unpleasant or just insensitive the way that I did meet in the early days.
I'd like to explore that in a moment in a bit more depth as well, because I saw a lot of people having their vaccine injuries dismissed or denied at the early stages. You know, we'd almost had this kind of constant line of safe and effective. Therefore, it seemed like it was beyond the realms of imagination that one could even get sick following a vaccine, at least according to, you know, the medical system, the pharmaceutical system, who are manufacturing and promoting the vaccines. Did you find that people were in denial or dismissive of the vaccine injury that you'd had?
Yes, but I think this goes back to way before COVID. I think our knowledge in general about vaccine injuries for a lot of people, and this isn't about intelligence. This is, you know, people tend to find out about these things through some kind of personal experience. Something has happened for them to find out about it, or they're very curious. They want to learn about things related to what was going on. But before COVID, I don't think vaccine injury was something that we talked a lot about. I think a culture had developed where it didn't seem acceptable to be talking about vaccine injuries or any kind of pharmaceutical harm. And there were people who were affected by other vaccines, the HPV girls who are now, I think, in their 20s, and who were affected by it. They've been struggling to get support and to get recognition and to be believed, and to get treatment. They've been struggling to do this for years. So I think that all of that was there before, and I think we went into the COVID vaccine rollout from that perspective. We came into it already not being able to talk about vaccine injuries or vaccine harm, and I think that had been going on for a very long time.
Yeah, it's almost what I would describe as an axiom, which is kind of an unchallengeable truth, you know, but isn't necessarily grounded in reality. You know, it's certainly unearthed a lot more questions, I think, and it's probably created the space for more people to come forward and share their stories. But you've been known to say that we don't respond in this way to any other health condition. What do you think is different about vaccine injuries specifically that makes people respond this way? You know, what's created this culture that you referred to?
I think that people desperately want vaccines to work, and people want vaccines to be good, and people believe that they are going to help, and something that's considered by many to be saving, to be, you know, promote health, to save lives. It's very difficult for people to question that. They want to believe that this is going to save people's lives and save their children's lives. So it's very difficult to think, can it do both things? Is it possible that something could possibly save lives, and could it also actually destroy lives? And that's a very difficult, we're not encouraged to be able to look at both sides of that topic. We're encouraged. I mean, in life in general, we're kind of encouraged nowadays, aren't we? You've got to pick a side, and that's it. And one's got to be good, and one's got to be bad. And we're not really encouraged to. Okay, can we have a conversation about a very different perspective of something? Can we have a respectful conversation? And can I have a conversation with somebody where I can learn something because they've got a completely different attitude towards it than I have? And we're just generally, that seems to have been lost. We don't seem to have a lot of those conversations. But I think it's difficult for a lot of people to, yeah, I think it's difficult for a lot of people to. I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with an MP, and she said to me, to be pro-vaccine means being pro supporting people who are harmed by vaccines, and you cannot have those two things. You have to be, of course, people will be harmed, and we have to support them. And you cannot be pro-vaccine if you're not willing to do that. And I thought that was very powerful.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction. It is so important that we recognize these drug adverse reactions and not limited to vaccines. But you and I met at the Better Way conference in Bath this year, last year now, 2022. Wow. Your talk received a standing ovation. It was a deeply emotive speech. It was incredibly powerful to witness myself. But I remember you opening your talk with something like, you were saying how you make people feel uncomfortable because you talk about what happened to you. And I think that's such a poignant statement. And you've referenced how people's perceptions or reactions to your situation have changed over time. Could you describe how they've changed? What was the, you said people are very sympathetic now and very understanding, but where did it begin? Did you get grief initially? Were you receiving negativity from people? I'm curious to see how it's changed and what you think's driven that change.
Yeah, I did. I mean, it started off from when I first posted on my social media that I was in hospital because I'd had an adverse reaction. I think the first response was, I hope this doesn't put people off. So it's gone from that kind of response, and now when I post updates about health, I don't use the word vaccine. Well, you can't, because you censored on social media anyway. So if I'm on Facebook or Instagram, then I don't use the word vaccine. If I'm on Twitter, I do. If I mention it now related to my health, if I'm talking about my health, and I try to share lots of health updates or interesting things that I'm learning along the way, if I share that, it's often now responded to with lots of people talking about all sorts of things about the vaccine, and these are people who have had 3-4 COVID jabs, but they're now so they would consider themselves very pro-vaccine, but they are able to respond in a very kind and compassionate way. And that's just happened over time. And I think perhaps people in the beginning, when I was talking about it, probably thought, oh, it'll be over in a month. And I think I probably thought that too. And I definitely thought I'm going to dedicate 3 months to my healing, and then I'm going to be recovered and I'll be back, doing life again. And I think other people thought that too. And as it's gone on for, we're 2 years, what am I now? 2 years, 8 months or something. It's been 2 years and 8 months of constant trying all sorts of different things, spending an extraordinary amount of money. And I've been very public about all of it. And I think probably people have watched that. And I haven't become angry. I haven't become shouty and ranty. I can't say I haven't become sweary, because I've always been a bit sweary. But so there's been a little bit of that, but I haven't become a very angry. Yeah. Oh no. I do a whole load. Oh, like, yeah, the sweary books. Yeah. So I've done it. I've tried to communicate about it all without communicating in a way that makes people kind of turn away. When we communicate with anger, I think it can make a lot of people turn away unless they already agree with everything we say. So if people agree with everything you say, then they'll get angry as well with you, and you can all be angry together. But if you're talking to people who are uncomfortable with what you're talking about and maybe don't agree with what you're talking about, you can't continue talking about it in an angry way. You have to talk about it in a very gentle way. And I think because I've done that throughout the whole of this time, on the whole, people have paid more attention, and they've been listening to other things that they've heard other people talking about. Everybody knows somebody who hasn't been feeling right. So I think that's been part of why people continue to, now they are very sympathetic and kind when they're communicating about it. Sorry, that was a bit of rather a long kind of tangent I went on there.
Well, I think it's so important. No, it's really important because, we went from talking about the kind of culture where people won't talk about vaccine injuries in particular, but we actually ended into a place where we can't talk about medical injuries at all. It became unacceptable. And I think one of the challenges is when you're in a culture like that where you can't talk about medical illnesses or injuries, people don't feel heard. And it's almost like it takes us almost into that childlike or teenage-like state where if we don't feel heard, we start to raise our voices. And it's not limited to teenagers, it's unfair to say that, but it's almost like a maturity that enables us to maintain that calm, cool, collected tone of voice in order to build empathy and trust with others. But I completely understand because I've experienced it myself where, if you don't feel that you're getting through to someone about something important, and particularly where, you almost are looking out for people's better interests. It's the same way if I was crossing the road and there was a car coming, I'd do everything I could do to stop someone from running into the road to get hit by the car. And I think a lot of people who've had vaccine injuries or people who've been studying the science of the injuries, and if they haven't felt like their message is getting through, it's almost like they're raising their voice, they're getting out louder and louder and more passionate, potentially. But that can turn into anger and despair. And I think that's where actually it's easy then to rally the kind of angry mob. But how to get through to the scientific or medical establishment, how to get through to other people is much harder when we raise our energy in that way, I think. So I think it's really important the way that you've followed that. But, what advice would you give to other people when they're trying to navigate this kind of subject? Because you've been consistent, you've been relentless, but in a very compassionate and empathetic and kind, caring way. I'm not saying other people haven't done that, but I'm looking at how people can communicate effectively around this subject, because it has been so polarizing. It was like a vacuum, a void where people couldn't even, we're using the word vaccine on here because we're going to publish it on Rumble, but we still can't really talk about it in the public domain. So how do we create that bridge? How do we enter into the space of conversation? What advice would you give people to begin that conversation?
I think when I was working out how I was going to navigate these conversations, I kept reminding myself that most people generally want the world to be a better place. Most people want to be decent people. And most people aren't evil. And for some people, making the world a better place means vaccinating as many people as possible. They genuinely believe that. And for some people, making the world a better place means protesting and being angry and shouty and stopping as many people as possible being vaccinated. But both groups genuinely, most people do, I think, genuinely want the world to be a better place. They just go about it in very different ways. So that was one thing that I kept reminding myself of. Another thing that I kept reminding myself of is none of us are born knowing everything. And even if we learn about all sorts of different things, and we still don't know everything. And what we think we know now is the truth might be something different in time. It might be different from what we felt was the truth in our past. And wherever you are with your beliefs, that's true for all of us. Who can say hand on their heart, I know everything there is to know about this particular topic right now, and what I know is the truth? none of us actually know that hand on heart. We know, this is something we believe at the moment, and we're going to move forward with that belief. But we don't know that. So that can change all the time. Information changes, our beliefs change if we stay open to learning and evolving. So that was something else that I kept reminding myself of. And then the other thing is, I'll think about how to express this. When it comes to vaccines, and this is a little bit similar to what I was talking about before, I think, the pain of a parent who has lost their child to a vaccine is the same pain as a parent who believes their child would still be alive had they been vaccinated. And those three things, I think, are things that I continued reminding myself of as I was trying to communicate in a kind and compassionate way about something that I knew was going to make people very uncomfortable, but I needed to keep talking about it. So I think trying to just bring the humanity back, I suppose, in the topic, and remembering that until that becomes your habit and the way that you communicate. I think that's important.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it's almost the lost art of empathy, and I would suggest that the world of empathy is even more challenging in the digital realm, where you don't have the same physical proximity to someone to be able to. There's almost a decorum that one has in a physical space. You don't end up in the same kind of ranty, shouty engagement that you can end up on social media. But as you were speaking, I can almost anticipate some of the reactions, because it takes real empathy to understand the intention of others, because you can't ever really determine someone's intent. It's very tricky, particularly if you have no direct contact. And when you said about how the medical system, their belief is that getting as many people to be vaccinated as possible is doing the right thing, and we certainly saw that. We even saw the MPs using that phrase, describing it as people doing the right thing. It becomes very hard for people to stomach when they see people like yourself who have been injured and others, and they start to hear those stories, not only just being injured, but some people losing their life. I think there's almost that goodwill starts to diminish when those individuals who, in their mind are doing the right thing, but are then unwilling to confront, or seemingly unwilling to confront, the other side of the equation, as you mentioned earlier with the MP who said you can't be pro-vaccine unless you're willing to confront the side effects and the adverse reactions. And I think that's where I see people turning to becoming very angry very quickly, because it's that lack of acknowledgement. What you've shared there is an empathetic point of view, which shows you understand different people, their different perspectives. Doesn't mean you have to accept it. You can acknowledge it at least, though, so you can understand why people do what they do. But what is your take on that, when the medical establishment, the political establishment, they seemingly are either completely naive to these vaccine injuries or turning a blind eye? How do you deal with that?
Can I go back to one word that you mentioned as you were talking there, and then you'll have to probably remind me of your question when we come back to that. But I want to pick up on that word goodwill that you used then. I don't think this is coming from a position of goodwill. I think it comes from this kind of attitude, trying to, think that people do genuinely want the world to be a better place, and that, people believe they're doing the right thing. And my attitude of trying to understand that and trying to empathize with that doesn't come from goodwill. It comes from, if I want to live in a world which is full of kindness and compassion and understanding and communicates respectfully, especially when I disagree with somebody, I can't just expect that world to magically happen. I have to be that. So I have to create that world around me, and so it's not from a goodwill perspective. And I think that's quite important to that it's a responsibility I want to have to create that world around me of kindness and compassion and respect.
I think that's a really important distinction. Yeah, and thanks for clarifying that. I think that really does add a dimension to the conversation. But I suppose nonetheless, despite having that empathy and understanding and compassion for others, where does the line start to draw for you personally when people refuse to acknowledge what's happened? Particularly as someone who's you're not just observing. Myself as an observer, I'm in a very different predicament. I can only empathize to a certain degree, having not lived the experience myself. But you've lived the experience, and I'm sure you've witnessed people denying that these things are happening, just completely reasserting that they're completely safe, and MPs turning a blind eye. How do you reconcile with that, despite having that empathy and compassion?
So let's talk about the medical, and then we'll talk about the MPs separately, because I've had experience with both. And I can just share my experience and how I've kind of navigated those two areas, if you like. So when it comes to anybody medical, anyone to do with healthcare, I don't tend to go to modern health medicine for anything. I do regularly talk to my GP, who is interested, and I like her. So I want to keep her informed, but I don't go to her for any treatment or anything. Even if there was some, I'm very happy with what I'm doing, which is completely different from anything the modern medicine offers. So but before I talk, if I need to talk to somebody new, and actually this applies to modern and traditional medicine, if they are not vaccine injury aware, and I'm going to be talking about my health, I don't see them. I'm not even going to bother having that conversation with them, because that could make me quite stressed. It could put me in a situation where I'm having to explain what's happened to me, and I'm being gaslighted, and I'm not going to put myself in that situation. So I developed this rule quite early on, where if somebody wasn't vaccine injury aware, I just wouldn't spend my time with them. I'm not going to invest any time with them, because the emotional impact on me could be too negative. So that's one thing, is I just don't. At some point they will or they won't learn about vaccine injury. It's not my responsibility to be teaching a medical professional about vaccine injury. I'm happy to educate what I call people who ask me about it with kind curiosity. I'm happy to talk to them as a medical professional. Hopefully that will help other people. But if they're not interested, they don't believe in it, they don't know anything about it, I'm just not going to have that conversation. So that's one thing. And that was for my benefit. And I would recommend anybody in that situation, if you wanted to protect their mental health at all, then just don't put yourself in that situation where you're talking to them. That particularly applies to vaccine injured, I think, who often think, right, I've got to get in, I'm going to see a medical person, and how am I going to convince them? It's like, well, that's not your job. You don't do that. You don't need to convince them to that shouldn't be what you're doing. Now, when it comes to MPs, this is quite an interesting one for me to talk about, because I actually coordinate and set up our MP campaign for UK CV Family. And so I speak to a lot of MPs about vaccine injured, and I see a lot of communication between MPs and their constituents about vaccine injuries. And actually, there's I think the latest, it's either 80 or 90 MPs who are working to support their vaccine injured constituents, and they are aware, and they are working to help them and trying to help them get better healthcare or access to benefit services, or they're doing what they can to try and support them. Some of them asking questions in Parliament, and well, as a group, UKCV family, we've had a presentation. We gave a presentation in Parliament, a confidential presentation to a bunch of MPs who wanted to learn more about us as a group, rather than just support their individual constituents. So I think there is more support from MPs than a lot of people think there is, and I think that I've seen a lot of kind of lumping MPs all together and saying that they don't care and they're not interested. I think they do. I think some of them do, and I've met some of them that do, and I've talked to some of them that do. I think that the kind of tagging on social media, tagging an MP, saying, why aren't you supporting the vaccine injured? Why aren't you interested in this? In a very angry way. I don't think that helps anything. I've seen MPs that I've had private meetings with be tagged on social media, accused of not caring about the vaccine injured, and I've literally just had a 2-hour meeting with some of them. And I think people in this world often think they know everything that's going on, and they don't. There's lots of quiet, gentle, again, kind and compassionate conversations going on quietly behind the scenes. They might not be thrown all over social media and might not be publicly announced or anything, but things are happening, and support has been, it is there. It's not the case at all that MPs don't care. It's too much of a generalisation. My MP's been incredibly supportive right from the beginning, and there are other people who have very supportive MPs too.
Yeah, I think that's important. There's so many important that for us is very similar to our philosophy. And I've always said that anger is like a boomerang. If you throw anger out into the world, it's eventually just going to come back and hit you. It's that you perpetrate greater anger in the world, but at the same time, I can completely understand it. I've experienced anger, despair, frustration, and I've had to work really hard to learn how to channel that and maintain my sense of sovereignty over my emotions, and bring, and almost what I call transmute it into positive energy so that I can utilize it for positive means. But it's not easy. So I'm curious to explore, over the course of your journey over the last couple of years, has there been moments of anger and despair and frustration, and how have you dealt that with yourself? How have you channeled that?
There has, and I don't. There has, and I don't think that there's anything wrong with having those emotions at all. And I don't believe in toxic positivity, or I'm very realistic, and I think. No, I am. People often think that just because I'm quite smiley and I'm quite talkative, and I probably come across as being quite positive, and I think people somehow misinterpret that as thinking, oh well, she's just convinced that being positive is making her better. There's nothing like that at all, and I don't think that anybody thinking positively is not going to get you out of a vaccine injury. It's not. Or any other kind of really chronic long-term health condition. Actually, positive thinking isn't going to fix this. But I think that so the emotions that you mentioned, I've had all of those, and something may well happen tomorrow. I mean, I don't want to jinx anything now, but something may well happen tomorrow that may spark me up again. But it's not. I had to I made a decision earlier on where I didn't want those emotions, anger in particular, I didn't want that to be the predominant force. I had seen what anger was doing to people who were more aware than I mean, I was ignorant, but I was contacted in the early months by a lot of very, very angry people who had been aware of what the vaccines and what was happening. They'd been aware of it for quite some time, and they were very angry, and they channeled that anger towards me as well as to other vaccine injured. And this has happened to a number of us. And when you get messages from people saying, you're going to die, and people taking screenshots of things that you're posting on your social media and sharing it and laughing amongst their friends, saying that, look, this person should be dead soon, this kind of thing. When you're subject to that, and saying things like, you deserve it, you deserve to die, and when you receive that, and that comes from a place of anger, then I made a decision. I don't want to be that. And I could see very easily, because of this experience, I could end up a very angry person, and I didn't want to be like that. But those feelings are valid. They are valid. And yes, I have been angry, and I have called unsympathetic people all sorts of names. I think on social media I was very unpleasant about one doctor I had a very unpleasant experience with. This is all in the early days now, before I was learning a way to deal with it. And, I was very distressed and angry. And there's a kind of, we talk about this a bit in the injured community, but I think it's about 76% of us have had suicidal thoughts since becoming vaccine injured. And that's been, and I've had, hand up, I've had those thoughts too. It's been horrific. And partly those thoughts, I think they're not necessarily to do with mental health. I think there's actually a chemical, there's something happens in your body chemically that brings about those thoughts, actually, is my experience. Because when I have one of the treatments that I have, which is a physical treatment, those thoughts have instantly disappeared. So I think there's actually something chemical going on with many of us that have impacted those kinds of thoughts. But yeah, I've been there. I've had all of those different thoughts, and spent days crying in the early months when I couldn't go for a walk, couldn't walk. I was leaning on my boyfriend like I was a really old woman, and not being able to function at all. And everything that makes your life worthwhile disappears in an instant when you're vaccine injured. You can't work, you can't exercise, depending on the nature of the injury, but the vast majority of us would say this. You can't work, can't exercise, you can't, some people can't even sit in the sunshine, you can't sit outside, you can't eat a lot of things because you react to so much. You lose friends, some people lose family, and some people don't. If a lot of the people around you don't believe what's going on, then that affects everything in your life is completely disrupted very quickly, and that's very, very difficult for anybody to deal with.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear all of that. I mean, particularly the horrific comments that you've had from people who are supposedly, quote unquote, on the same side, fighting the cause because of these injuries. And I've seen the same. So it comes as no surprise, sadly. And, the same is true of some of the doctors and scientists who initially were promoting the vaccines, or they took the vaccine and they later either had personal experiences themselves, or they saw the data, or they saw changes in what was happening, and therefore they changed their position. It's almost like people are unwilling to embrace those individuals as they take a new path. And in many ways, you have to ask, well, you spend so much time trying to educate people about these issues, yet when people actually do change their mind, you push them away. And it's like, when you extend it, how do we extend an olive branch? And I'm thinking of people like Asim Malhotra, John Campbell, these are very prominent figures now who had very different positions at the beginning, and they've changed, but I've seen they've been subjected to great abuse for similar reasons and similar comments. And to me, it comes back to that, why I said at the beginning of this conversation is as much about dealing with injuries as it is dealing with compassion and empathy. Because ultimately, if we want to embrace this conversation, then we have to be open with others. And what I'm witnessing and hearing from you is a very powerful story in that empathy and compassion, to be able to see the world through other people's eyes, even if you can't walk a day in their shoes. And what that does, and how it creates a bridge. And it also brings a depth of understanding, having heard your story, because I've also heard you say about, those who are willing to listen to you, they perhaps don't understand how necessary it is to hold the vaccine injured gently because of how difficult things can be, whether it's the physical symptoms, the mental symptoms, the emotional, but also the social symptoms, as you've outlined. Could you share a little bit more about what you mean by that? Because you're right, more and more people now know people who've been vaccine injured. It's very scary for a lot of people. How can we treat those who have suffered more gently in this time? Because it's still just unfolding, in my view.
Yeah, well, actually, one of my dogs is about to start snoring. I apologise. You might hear it through here. Um, actually, at the beginning of this conversation, you didn't ask me to go through all of my symptoms in detail, and that's an example of holding a vaccine injured person gently. Actually, you started that yourself, and when you talk to vaccine injured people about their symptoms or their experiences, they're often reliving it all, and we sometimes get the people who are sympathetic to us sometimes will ask us to get on a stage or on a microphone and to relive the moments of what was one of the most terrifying days in our lives, and then just expect that to come up on a stage, do that, and then go away again. And um, there's no gentle holding of that afterwards. So after you've done all of that and you've shared everything that's happened to you, those emotions are still very raw in your body. They're kind of been brought back up again, and it's on to the next thing. The people who've asked us to speak about them, they go on to the next thing, but they don't forget that person then is living in that world again and reliving that world. And this happens when we have media requests, and with UKCV Family, whenever we have people contact us to talk to any of our members or to ask to talk about anything, them to talk about what happened to them, we always make sure they have mental health support within our community, or as in the case with the documentary that we did, we made sure that they provided mental health support for everybody who appeared in it. So that is what I mean by holding the vaccine injured very gently, from people who are supportive. So if you're asking lots and lots of questions and then just moving on to the rest of your life, I've had it happen when I've met people in the street and they've realised that they'd heard one of my speeches before, or they knew of me through something, and they bombarded me with questions about what exactly happened to me, and then just went off and had their lunch in a restaurant together. And it's that level of can we just show a bit of gentle kindness, of understanding? We're not going to ask people randomly. We will ask permission first. Do you mind if I ask you about it? Or would you be willing to share some information about it? It's that kind curiosity. So I can understand that people are very curious about this. I get that, but do it with kindness and sensitivity. You wouldn't ask anybody who'd been through something horrific, and this is horrific when it actually happens. Particularly if you have a very violent reaction, like I did, when it happens, it's terrifying, and we don't ask anybody to just stand on the street and relive the most horrific experience of their lives, just in a few minutes. Just share it all in a few minutes, and you bring it all back up again, and then they just go off. But it happens a lot. So I think people can just be gentle, ask permission, be aware that people who are vaccine injured are exhausted a lot of the time. Any conversation that you have is going to be incredibly draining, and also to have a bit of respect for their time. For example, today, I'm very careful about my time, and I will only have one conversation with with a person each day, and you are my conversation for today. And that, so don't kind of cancel things at the last minute, or don't show, if you want to vaccine injured people to be talking to you, then just show a bit of respect for the fact that they have probably put an extraordinary amount of preparation into being able to have that meeting or that lunch or whatever it is with you, and then after that they will have to pay for that. So that kind of thing as well, about treating, it's the same way you would with anybody who had any kind of serious chronic ongoing illness. But we don't really understand or show a lot of respect for any chronic illness. I think I've learned a lot about the ME/CFS community, and they, again, it's another area, another group of people who've been struggling with the same kind of struggles that we have, and they've been struggling for years.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I'm really curious to explore whether, I mean, I don't want to put labels on things, but it sounds, from what you've described, that it's it can be a very traumatic experience. And in many ways, I wonder if what we discussed at the beginning around the lack of acceptability of the conversation around vaccine injuries or indeed medical situations themselves, that has perhaps created this sort of blind spot, because again, the media presentation of the vaccine itself is, the bombardment of this idea that it's safe and effective. And in many ways, the media narratives around vaccine injuries have been very much diminishing the impact of the vaccine injury, describing them as mild or generally mild. And that creates a perception in people's mind that they perhaps, when they're talking to someone's vaccine, they almost can't see the possibility that this person's been through a deeply stressful, traumatic, or painful experience and may continue to be dealing with that. Do you think that's a blind spot that's been created, that's created that gap in understanding?
I do. I completely agree. It's almost impossible for some people to acknowledge, to recognise it. No, again, like I said, less so now, but definitely in the beginning, it's dismissed. And actually, one of the Daily Express covered, I think it was in March that it came out. The Daily Express did a few different stories on our community and individuals within it. They did, including one on me. And the way that they covered it, I think it was the first mainstream media article that didn't have, about 2/3 of the article was about how safe and effective they were. They just didn't even mention it at all, which is how, in my opinion, vaccine injuries should be covered. So that idea about does it work, does it not, how safe and effective it is, if you're going to be talking about vaccine injured and what's happening to them and how we help them, in actual fact, those other conversations are irrelevant and distracting from the very fact is this has happened to these people. There is nothing in place to help them. We were not prepared. We never have been prepared, and they need help. So don't pull me into a conversation about the pros or cons of any of it. The fact is, these are the people that we're talking about, and they need help right now. So let's just keep that conversation about that. But people seem to be unwilling to allow us to have that conversation. If they're pro, it's like, oh well, it's mild. It's it hasn't happened to many people. And if you're against it all, then it's like, well, you shouldn't have had it in the first place. So we haven't been allowed to have that conversation about, look, this has happened to us, and we need help. And can somebody just help us, rather than using what's happened to us in whatever way you want the conversation to go? Can we just have that conversation about what we do for people who are harmed by vaccines or any other pharmaceuticals?
Yeah, that's so important. Well, on that point, if you've got the energy for it, I'd love to shift and now talk about your journey of recovery and some of the things that you've learned. And that's probably an hour-long conversation in itself. But I'm curious to discover some of the things that you've embraced and learned over the last couple of years. Because delighted to hear that you're making a marked improvement. Certainly when I last heard about your journey, you'd only got to kind of like a third of your usual activity, but delighted to hear you've made some great progress. Would you mind sharing some of the highlights of some of the things that you've learned and some of the, you've spoken about how you've gone beyond the boundaries of the traditional medical system. Could you share some of the key things that you've embraced and learned over the last couple of years in your own healing?
Yeah, I'm glad actually you used the word healing then, because I don't look at this as recovery. Actually, I think I've accepted that life is going to be different in a lot of different ways. And recovery, I think, implies returning back to how you were before. So, for my personal situation, I think a lot more about healing and how do I move forward with maybe new limitations, or how life is different now, and just going through the whole experience is going to, as any big experience in our lives, it always we carry it with us, don't we, to one extent or another. So the number one game changer for me, which I talk a lot about, is I do regular therapeutic phlebotomy, and that is involves having blood taken out for discard. So it's not being tested; it's being dumped, basically blood dump. So I do that now I do it every 2 weeks for maintenance, but I have to do it every 2 weeks. So that has been the game changer for me. So and I discovered that, I think, by accident about 5 months after the jab. So the first 5 months were horrific, and then when I accidentally discovered that the removal of blood alleviated the symptoms temporarily, then I started having a little bit of quality of life again. And as I've carried on doing it, I have blood out, and then I have a little bit of life, and then I deteriorate, and then I have blood out, and it's a constant kind of cycle of needing to have blood out very regularly. But for me, that's been a massive game changer. I honestly don't think I would be here if I hadn't been doing that for now well over 2 years. I've been doing that regularly.
Is that something that's specific to your particular symptoms, or is that something you're seeing in common amongst those that have had vaccine injuries? Is it individual, circumstantial, circumstance specific, or is that a common theme?
There are other people who also get relief, notice that they have relief when they have a lot of blood tests done, for example. But I'm not aware of anybody who does it regularly like I do. But I think people are a bit nervous about looking into it, and it's hard to find somebody who will do it actually as well. So I started off, I had a private phlebotomist come to the house and take blood, and then I learnt how to do it myself. So I then became able to take it out, and I've got all the right equipment. And then I met an acupuncturist who performed traditional Chinese bleeding or bloodletting, and I go to her now. But I think people we're a bit funny about blood in England, aren't we? We're a bit uncomfortable seeing it, and we think it. Well, I shan't send you any of the photos that I've taken of it then, but it's yeah, we're a bit squeamish about it, so I don't think, I think people have found it difficult to be able to do it consistently, but I am aware of people who when they've had quite a lot of blood taken out for testing, they feel a bit cleaned out, so it's like that.
Do you get fatigue afterwards whilst you're kind of replenishing and regenerating, or
No,
is it almost an immediate
the opposite
sense
happens.
of renewal?
So I have blood taken out, and it restores all the functioning again. So I have more energy, cognitive thinking's very quick, and emotionally I feel really good. And I don't have the fatigue comes when I need to have it out. So today, I'm, like I said before, I'm due to have blood out tomorrow, so I know I'm not quite on top of my game chatting to you, but it's no fatigue at all. The exact opposite. I've taken before and after photographs, and my face has been very pale, and then it gets completely full of colour and it happens as soon as the blood starts coming out.
Wow, that's amazing. And what about some of the other things that you've tried? Because your book covers an awful lot of information, from food to stress management to keeping tabs on your circumstances and your improvement. It sounds like you've taken a really holistic approach, looking at almost every facet of healing in itself to come to that point of development, to get a sense of renewal and restoration that you've embraced.
I have, and first, with the book, it's not a book about my what I've done. There's I've mentioned it a little bit in there, but it's not a book that's about this is what I've done and this is going to treat everybody and cure everybody. That's not the case at all, and I think we're all completely different. So, and our bodies are complicated, and there are we've all got different things going on. So I don't think what necessarily is going to works for me will necessarily work for other people. But it's always good to know what other people are actually having success with. And it's good to hear that directly from the vaccine injured, I think, rather than to hear from practitioners who claim to be treating us, but they're actually not at all and not having any success. So the vaccine injured know an awful lot about what does help. No, the book is a way to manage an extraordinarily complicated situation that is very overwhelming, and the information available is very overwhelming. And if you start looking into things, there's lots of information out there about, do this and then that will fix you, and do this and this will fix you, and it's very difficult to manage all of that, particularly if you've got cognitive challenges. So what I wanted to do was put together, make a book that was very simple, made that whole process very simple, started it very simply with things like nutrition, and I've done a lot of different things with nutrition, experimented with different nutritional plans throughout this whole process, and for me it's been the simple things like no wheat, no sugar, no dairy, and very little processed food. I've stuck to that as I've improved anyway, but in the early months the food was a real challenge, because I was having all of these weird reactions out of nowhere. I'd never reacted to food in my life, and I was having very strange reactions to food. And I think the most entertaining one was when I got drunk eating an apple. That was hilarious. And a few months earlier, I'd been on an apple fast. I did a 3-day apple fast. This is before the jab, and then after the jab, I couldn't even eat one apple. It just went straight to my head. So everything around food when you're vaccine injured becomes very complicated. So that chapter's all about organising that, and the same, as it's gone through all of these different elements of healing. So there's 6 chapters based on, right, let's focus on 6 topics of healing, and anybody can use them no matter what symptom it is that they're dealing with. They can still use those principles. So other things that have helped me, high copper diet. And this is quite interesting because there's actually scientific research into copper and COVID, a connection with copper and COVID. So that's quite interesting for people to look up if they do want to look. There are scientific papers published showing that copper helps with COVID. And copper for me was a game changer. That brought back an extra percentage of functioning. So, and I continue to take that. I'm still on a very high copper, and I do that with diet and with supplements. And I have actually, here's my copper vessel that I drink water out of as well. So I have a copper pillow and just any opportunity to get extra copper in. Nicotine patches have been really helpful. And again, nicotine is something, there's some scientific research in nicotine and COVID. So and there's a lot of people in the vaccine injury community talk about nicotine and how helpful nicotine can be with managing symptoms. I find it restores energy, clarity of thinking, and it means I can get through a full day if I need to, if I've got an important meeting or something where I can't have a sleep in the middle of the day, then it will get me through an entire day. Lumbrokinase, I'm never sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it's an enzyme that breaks down. I don't know. Well, there's 3 enzymes: so lumbrokinase, nattokinase, and serrapeptase. And a lot of vaccine injuries were all on, one of those or some combination of those. And it's a natural enzyme that breaks down. It's to do with blood clotting, helps prevent blood clotting, and helps break down blood clots. So, I respond very well to lumbrokinase, actually. And fasting, intermittent fasting, has been another one. So these are kind of my tools for my personal situation, and intermittent fasting's been really good. That's helped with energy levels too. And I can't seem to get away from the need for aspirin, and I'm so reluctant to take any pharmaceutical products, but aspirin, if I stop aspirin, then I've had up to 30 migraines a month. So there's something to do with that combination, lumbrokinase and aspirin, and those seem to work very well for me, to be able to keep migraines at bay, touch wood. Has
there been any exploration of things like CBD or cannabis oil?
I did try it and didn't seem to do anything for me. I tend to respond quite quickly to things. I tend to my body's, I'm quite in touch, I think, with my body now and what seems to work well. So I did try that, and I didn't feel anything. I didn't see any improvement, but that's not necessarily to say that I wouldn't try things again. Sometimes I think we need a different combination. Maybe it works with something else, or maybe our body's busy focusing on one thing, and so can't fully make the most of that other product. So I'd be open to trying it again, but at the time when I tried it, I didn't get anything from that.
Yeah, it's not easy to get the quality of the product in such a newly regulatory approved. It's also become mass produced very quickly. What made me mention it is because a lot of the protocols that you've mentioned, very interestingly, my wife's mother, Caroline, was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer. She's passed now, but it was an incurable type of cancer at the time, which is caused by exposure to asbestos. It's called mesothelioma. She was given 3 to 6 month diagnosis, but she ended up living for close to 6 years by following actually many of the things that you've outlined. And what I learned during that time working with Lizzie to do whatever we could to support Caroline is we found that a lot of the things that we discovered that were put forward as potential treatments or solutions or healing pathways are actually very common to almost every chronic illness. And it made us both think, and Lizzie's whole path has changed now. She's just opened her own gym. She's, the last 10 years, she's dedicated herself to supporting women with their health and fitness and well-being. But we did ask the question, what would happen if just quote unquote healthy people followed these protocols? How much more healthy would we become? And we also asked lots of questions around, well, how much of this is due to deficiency, due to the nutrition in the soil and the produce that we're eating, environmental pollutants? How much of this, things like copper, which there are many nutrient-rich foods that should include these kind of elements that are just seemingly lacking. So it spurred this real curiosity and interest in overall well-being and health, and it's just fascinating because, again, cannabis oil is one of the things that she tried, which is why I was curious And again, she had a similar. It took a while for it she ended up getting it imported from somewhere like Canada or something, to get the kind of quality of product that she wanted. So it was just fascinating. And the kind of last part I want to draw from this comparison is that you mentioned the psychological impact on mental health, emotional health, and how a shocking number of people have gone to the depths of despair. It may be chemically induced, but nonetheless, the ebbs and flows of the journey, the ups and the downs. What have you done to kind of manage your emotional, psychological state during this? Because you've clearly you've developed, perhaps your previous career had given you some sort of resilience, but you've clearly got that resilience now that's driving you forward, not only to manage your own healing, but, to put an enormous amount of effort to help other people, which in itself requires real energy and focus. And it's hugely commendable. So I'm really curious to know what you've done to manage that side of your well-being and healing.
Well, I went to a counsellor within weeks of the vaccine, so I started going to counselling very quickly. I recognised it, and I think that's a big step, is knowing that something is going on, that even if your mental health hasn't been affected at that time, but if you've got something quite dramatic physically going on within the culture that we have around it, then that is going to have a mental health impact. So trying to put things in place beforehand. So I did that. One thing I wonder if I was, even before the jab, I'm not sure I was particularly good at setting boundaries, and that's something I've had to learn to do with this. So I'm very careful who I let into my emotional space, I think. And if there are people who don't respect that, then I try not to be too invested in that. They're not going. I'm not going to allow them close enough. So I think that I've done that. It's not always about. We think often when we're talking about managing our mental health, that it's got to be something to do with talking to a counsellor or something like that, and that's only one part of it. Part of it is being very good at protecting yourself. So I've done that, and foods. I've noticed certain foods can really affect my mood. So it's like I've become hypersensitive to a lot of things now, and I think a lot of vaccine injured would say that. So I'm very careful to avoid those foods, or to be aware that if I have an emotional response after eating them, it's just the food. It's not, it isn't actually, I'm not distressed, I'm not overwhelmed. There's something that I've just eaten which has had some impact. And there are a couple of other things that I thought about now. A sense of humour. So I have a
Yes,
no, it's true. I have a really childish and sweary and kind of toilet sense of humour. I do. It's terrible, and I feel that that's got even worse since I got vaccinated. And I remember,
you should have brought it out. We should have
no,
started there today.
no, I try to keep it. If I'm talking like this, I try to keep it under wraps a little bit. But if you watch any of the Charlotte and I, Crichton is the founder of UKCV Family, and we have a little podcast that a YouTube channel where we're very careful what we say, but we are so childish, and so we have such a silly sense of humour. So I've really embraced that. And I think I remember talking to an American friend, and she said she couldn't stop swearing after she got jabbed. And we all thought, right, we need to have that added to the list of side effects now, because we just can't stop. So, but I think it's a reaction to when you're dealing with something very, very serious and life-threatening and extremely challenging. I think you develop, if you didn't have it already, you develop quite a dark sense of humour, and or in my case a particularly childish one has just got out of control, I think, sometimes. And I just think of it as balance. It's all balance, because sometimes I have very serious conversations with very serious people, and they're really very, very important, so I have to balance that with being very childish and silly and sweary. So and it sounds strange, but that's been a massive part of maintaining my mental health, actually. I've had to find laughter. Oh, and I thought, here's another thing. So when this probably would have been about 6 months after, and I was very aware that my mental health, it really needed support, and I was aware that I wasn't able to experience a lot of joy in life wasn't joyful at all. There was nothing joyful going on, and I was concerned about the part of my brain that was related to joy, about that not being stimulated enough. And I thought, this is going to be, I need that to be able to, so that I'm not immersed in this misery all the time, so I'm going to have to do that. And I said, I wrote about this in the book, so I don't mind sharing this publicly, but I actually started writing erotic fiction for women purely to stimulate that part of my brain, and to get a little bit of joy back. And it worked. It did. It was helpful at that time. It did work. It did work. It made me smile again, and gave me something to giggle about. And it was, it was funny. The idea of, I was sitting there, not able to do anything, but I could, write this rather saucy story. So it was fun. It worked.
Amazing. Well, I think that's so important. And the well, actually, I recorded with my co-host on another show, the Uncharted Territory podcast. It actually became more of a self-therapy conversation, because we both talked about how the challenge of the last 3 years can be emotionally draining. And I was going through that similar experience myself. I felt like I'd lost connection to the things that bring me joy and happiness, and just those moments of just playfulness. It's so essential to keep connected to that, despite what's happening in the world. And I remember once I was sat on the beach in Cornwall several years ago, and I'd been through some challenges in my business. And I think whenever we feel a sense of inner challenge or external challenge, if something's happening in the world that's causing stress or anxiety, then we can lose sight of that joy. And I wrote down in my journal, I'm a regular journaler, I wrote down, what am I happy about right now? And it was like my pen wouldn't move. I was like, oh gosh. So I changed the question to, what could I be happy about right now? And all of a sudden my brain went, well, I could be happy about the music I'm going to listen to in the car on the way home. And it just really took me on this path of, it's like the door opened in my head again, and this flooded these ideas of all the things that could bring me joy. And it was joy, the question, because actually I think happiness is more of a kind of, that's a whole philosophical conversation, but happiness can be more fleeting, whereas joy can be more enduring. And I think when we give ourselves permission to explore the things that bring us joy, it keeps that connection alive. And I think hearing what you're saying today is so beautiful, because I think there's the old adage that the seed of every adversity comes with it the seed of a great equal or greater opportunity. And in many ways, we've come here to talk about COVID vaccine adverse reactions, which obviously your book is about helping people to survive that journey and explore it. But you've also shared some of the upsides that have occurred as a result of it. Your ability, your renewed sense of boundaries, a deepened sense of resilience, and a sense of awareness now. So, you talk, on one hand, a heightened sensitivity to food. Also, now you have a heightened awareness, and many people are craving that sense of awareness, that present moment awareness, that connection, joy, and it. From the groups that you've been part of, the UK CV family, you've built that amazing support network, healthy boundaries, finding laughter, and again, these are all. If you look at everything I was talking about a moment ago in terms of the commonalities of good health, these are all practices for good health. So it comes as no surprise that that your healing is accelerating. And I think that in itself is a wonderful mindset to witness, because I think you can get two different people that have the exact same circumstances, but they approach it differently. And it's my hope that people listening or watching today will we'll get that sense of possibility from what you've shared, because it's easy, I think, whether it's you're dealing with these types of situations, that the adverse reactions, or you're just dealing with life in the present moment, which is, if you want to get stressed, just open Twitter or X, and it's just like, boom, the door of chaos opens to the madness of the world. But you've illustrated beautifully how when we can come back to ourselves, take the steps we need to move forward, then we can see remarkable results over time. And again, what's for me another beautiful reflection in kind of reflecting what I've taken from today is that Rome wasn't built in a day. The expectation you set, the intention of 3 months worth of healing, whilst it may have taken longer, you went about the daily steps required and you kept on the journey. And I think for a lot of people, regardless of what their circumstances are right now, people are looking for ways to improve their quality in life in the face of what's happening. And to me, it's been an important reminder that we've got to take those daily steps, because it's those things that create incremental change, whether it's incremental healing, incremental well-being, incremental flourishing. It's those things. And I agree that the positive mental attitude isn't going to heal you, but it may protect you a little bit from some of the madness in the world, at least in my view. I want to kind of close by, again, I'm no Joe Rogan, and Rogan would talk probably for 3 or 4 hours, but maybe he would have more respect for someone who's had the sort of situation you've had. But there's obviously some amazing resources out there now, including your book. You've shared your book, and it sounds to me like the UK CV family is a growing group of as a support network. And again, in anyone that's facing what you faced in the last few years, it seems to me that a support network is one of the fundamental ingredients of healing. Could you share a little bit about the group that you're a founding member of, and how people can find that, and what they can expect?
Yeah, so UK CV Family, we have a website, ukcvfamily.org, and we have a Twitter profile, but mainly we communicate on Facebook, and for that reason we're very careful about how we communicate. So firstly, if people want to join, they might be surprised that we have, we use different words for things. We can't speak directly on there. We are strictly only open to vaccine injured. We have a smaller group that is for bereaved, so bereaved families welcome to join that one, and we have another smaller group that's for carers. So people are welcome to join those. But the main group, which has over 1,200 members, and we have new people joining every day, that's strictly for vaccine injured. So anybody listening, please don't try to join that if you are, unless you're vaccine injured, because we are run entirely by volunteers and we are all injured ourselves. So it takes an extraordinary amount of time to, that is time away from our healing and our families, if we're managing that group. So now if you join it, you will find the most, I've never met so many kind, gentle people within one community. Usually online communities have always got somebody toxic in there, and multiple people who are toxic, and people are so aggressive, and it's not like that at all. People are gentle, they're respectful. You can, we get new people and they ask the same questions that have been asked a million times before, but still everybody's welcome to answer all the questions there. We have we do some social events for people who are up to that, sometimes in person. There have been meetups in different places around the country, but we have social Zooms, so online gatherings, and you can introduce yourself or not introduce yourself, and people can, if they are awake in the middle of the night, post on there. And there's a whole bunch of people who are also awake in the middle of the night, because all of us, sleep for a lot of people is a bit challenging when you're vaccine injured. And you will find people who have been through every single thing that you've been through, and they are there to offer support. We don't give any medical advice or anything like that, but people are welcome to share what's been working for them, and to ask questions about things that they want to try. But it's just an incredibly warm, supportive, kind community, and there's the support element, but then there's the advocacy element. And I mentioned the MP campaign earlier on. We've been working so hard on that, talking to MPs on behalf of our members. We've been doing that since March 2022. And we also now our media campaign is becoming we're having a lot more response from the media, a lot more interest in the media. We have core participant status in the module 4 of the COVID inquiry, which is about vaccines and therapeutics. So we're busy at the moment preparing our witness statement for that. And we're very active with the advocacy, but we are mainly a support group. It's a wonderful group. I don't know quite when I first found other people online who were also vaccine injured, it made a huge difference to my whole experience about it.
Oh, that's incredible. Yeah, so important what you're doing, and I'm so grateful that you've managed to keep it alive on Facebook. Code language, we made the decision before our conversation with you today that we wouldn't, I'm tired of self-censoring at the moment. On Facebook, I'm just using code language, and it's like, oh my, I had 12 months shadow ban. The moment it was over, we were back to the numbers we were getting prior to the ban, and this one's going to go out and rumble. So, and our private community. So we were happy just for anything to go, including, by the way, which I'll, because I want to tell people about where to get your book. And I know that you can get it on the dreaded Amazon, but I would encourage people to go to your website to get it. I think they can buy it directly from you, can't they, Caroline?
They can. I need to get some more copies in, but they can. And I think you can buy it directly from the Chelsea Green website as well.
Yes, that's right. Yes. Yeah, they've been very helpful, actually. But I would still encourage people to go to your website because they can get your sweary stickers. We've talked about that, and your ingratitude journal, which sounds amazing. I'm going to get myself a copy of that one. I think you get a real sense of your personality through your website. So I think and my team were so excited. I was trying to balance the excitement around navigating the subject, which is so important to so many of our audience, whilst we would one of Claire on my team in particular, she absolutely loves all of your wider work. So we were having a lot of fun in the preparation for today. So really, really pleased we could be with here again. And we've gone on for nearly 90 minutes now, and you're one day away from your blood therapy. So I want to give you some rest. So I want to express my honor and gratitude for you allowing us to be your conversation of the day. I'm very privileged to have that. And for our audience at home, I hope you share your appreciation and your views in the comments. I would say wherever you're watching or listening to this, but it's going to be Rumble. So, and if for our audience, a message to you at home, if you are interested in more conversations like this, I please implore you to subscribe to our Rumble channel, because it is going to be the only place. We've had so much of our content taken down over the last 3 years because of the conversations that we've had, and I'm no longer willing to self-censor. So please do subscribe on Rumble. Please also join our mailing list at danastingregory.com/pandemic. That's our fail-safe to reach you no matter what, if Rumble start getting turned by the letters that the government are sending to them. And importantly, please do check out Caroline's work. Do get a copy of the book. It's an incredible book. And as I mentioned, as we discussed, there is actually so many really useful principles for your own health, irrespective of whether you've had the sad reality of being affected by the COVID jabs. And my final plea to you before I come back to Caroline for her final words of wisdom to those of you at home is, if you know someone that's been unwell over the last few years surrounding having the vaccine, please refer them to this conversation, because Caroline is such a wonderful communicator, and often it takes a different voice outside of oneself. And if you're close to your family, I know how hard it can be to reach people that are closest to us. Please share this episode. It could change their life. And I want to come to you, Caroline, to close out by asking you to share what is your most important piece of advice to someone who has been through a similar situation to you. What would you say to people at home, or where would you recommend people? How would you recommend people help those that are struggling? We've talked about treating people who are suffering gently. What advice would you give people at home about helping others with vaccine injuries?
So firstly, if you're injured yourself, you have to know you are not alone. And you are not a tiny group of people. You are not alone. There are lots of us, and help is available from us, and help and support and friendship. So you're really not alone. That's the most important thing to remember. People who are helping other people at home. This is a question I was asked once. People who there were people who didn't know it was possibly vaccine related. They thought it was long COVID. They were being told it was long COVID, and somebody asked me, how do I convince them that actually they're vaccine injured? And I said to them, you don't need to. It doesn't matter. You just treat them kindly and help them heal. It doesn't matter what caused it. And that's something I think that's really important to remember.
Thank you, Caroline. Again, I'm so privileged to have you here with us today. I really appreciate this conversation. It's such an important, the work that you're doing is so important. You're doing it with a smile, you're doing it with empathy, you're doing it with compassion, you're doing it with a sense of humor. And that's so important in these slightly interesting times. These interesting times. I'll stop referring to them as the mad times. You kind of bring about what you think about these different times that we're going through. So much appreciation for you and respect. And thank you again from the Pandemic Podcast and all of our team and our audience. And good luck with your evidence at the core participant. I look forward to seeing the impact of that, and I'll watch live. I've been watching, all of the COVID inquiry sessions. It takes it out of me psychologically doing that, but I've very much relished seeing your evidence being produced. So thank you for that, and keep up the incredible work. And the final message I'll say to our audience, if you haven't seen it already, our last this conversation comes at a really important time, because there's a legal case that's taking place in the UK relating to the AstraZeneca vaccine, which we talked about today. In my last episode, we actually covered the details of that case and what that could lead to in other cases in the future. So if you haven't seen that one yet, please go check that one out. Again, only available on Rumble. Thank you again, Caroline. On behalf of all of us at the Pandemic Podcast, we'll see you again very soon. Please do subscribe to the mailing list at Astin-Gregory.com/pandemic, and go ahead and check out Caroline's book and her community. And thank you so much again for everyone being part of today's discussion.